by Friday to them. I think I'm giving up on the idea that it would be in the form of legislation, even though that is what was requested of us. Are there any objections to that piece of this? Do people feel like we need to do actual legislation? Because if we did,
Separation of powers.
Yeah.
I would suggest that, Chris, that you ask them what they would prefer and give them the choice of something that takes a little bit more time, so we can get it into the form of legislation, or be on their desk, and that way, you know, if they really wanted it looking like legislation.
We would need their help to do that.
Yeah, spectrum.
Yeah, that's a good point. Well, maybe it's a two-part thing. So give us the verbiage and then we'll.
Well, you can suggest that.
Yeah, okay. That's a good suggestion. Is that okay?
I like the suggestion of giving the report that's not legislation and saying, if you would like us, come back, give us some direction. I think that would be,
Okay.
rather than volunteering to do something that they'd rather do themselves anyway.
Okay. That sounds like, okay, that takes a little some of the pressure off of us. But we have this, I very much appreciate everybody's engagement on what was a very tough time frame, the meeting we had last week, and Phyllis, thank you so much for turning that around in terms of the meeting notes and expectations for people to review. We received some comments from people on the initial sections on planning and incentives. And at this point, my suggestion would be you take it by section and see what people, just by number of the outline, and see if people have consensus on generally what that point is, or if there's more discussion that people want to do. The comments are in red or blue, depending on your version, I guess. Yep, in blue.
Does everyone have the blue?
Everybody have the additions in blue?
Great.
Yes,
The difference between what you have in front of you now and what you received last night is that there are some areas where there were brackets that said still need statutory language, and between last night and this morning, we tried to get some of that in, so those areas are highlighted.
So would that work as a process for people, just go one section at a time? Yes, Ann?
Chris, should we do the minutes first from the previous?
Yes, we should. See? That's why it's important to have 16 people up in as we go through. So we have minutes from January 5th, last week. Can I get a motion?
So moved.
Sharon, thanks. Second?
Second.
Thank you, Adam. Okay, discussion.
I had abstained from the minutes, approving the minutes last time because I wasn't there.
There's some statements here, and some of the additions are to discuss, to do an introductory section in writing that support this and to strengthen the quality of RPC municipal planning projects. I'll open it up for discussion for item one. Let's see where people are.
After the intro?
Yes, but if you want to include your comments in terms of what the intro comments are, or the comments reflect, that would be okay too.
I should mention, we did submit comments after a meeting Friday, but not in time to incorporate them in this, so depending on how things break out today, we might add some things in.
Right. Are you going to track that, Sharon? Because
Yeah.
we did have those sent to us, but I don't think we
Right. Have some copies, yeah.
So you'll just let us know when it's relevant.
Yeah, and basically, in terms of the intro, we thought it was fine. Again, this is the most critical part for us as planners. So we have some suggestions with regard to what should be referenced, background and context in that regard.
I guess I should observe that when I commented, many of my comments were the presentation more than the substance of. I'm opposed to this, in favor of that. And I had a vision of what the report might look like. I guess I would just defer to, or hear from. I don't see no reason to go over what I'm saying. I just whether you want to frame the report that way, or whether you want it to just be a series of suggestions. So I think this is So what would be behind any of this narrative, these suggestions for adding narrative?
Yeah.
I think a narrative would help.
I think the narrative helps in a lot of cases, and we can explore that in the next 2 days. But I think for today's meeting, and we're gonna be really tight in terms of even getting through that, is just to really make sure that we have consensus or decision on the actual recommendations. Because we can write it up afterwards, but we need to know whether people are okay with the recommendations themselves.
Yeah. In terms of our comments on the intro, we probably provide a little more detail, but it's all consistent with what's in there now, what other people have said.
With respect to item 2, are we on item 2?
Well, we're on
Sorry,
phase
no,
1,
why is
ABC, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2. Which one are you?
Yeah.
We're on item
But
1.
The actual outline under 1, the 2 on page 1. Energy planning is already mandatory for RPCs. They are required to do energy elements. What I would suggest is moving that optional powers thing. And actually, we had a version, another thing to move over to moving the current distributed energy planning from the optional powers of RPCs over to the required. So it's a little bit different section of statute, but it basically gets to the same thing.
When I read these, I was assuming there would be preparatory language that talked about what the RBC planning initiative is and what we're buying from it.
Sure.
And so if that were the case, then number 2 makes sense. So I was assuming that there was going to be an introductory sort of context and more to it.
Yeah, and that's actually what we also outlined in our comments.
Yes, which I
I think
appreciate.
each of these needs some discussion and introduction of some sort, so, yep.
So maybe going through the recommendations, if we assume that,
Right.
that might be helpful, yeah.
And funding.
And funded, yeah.
Well,
Well, funding is actually a pretty big question. I'd say we treat this as a generic issue. Maybe.
well, so we can't assume funding, we have to recommend funding. Right.
Well, like Chris has got, but I want to make sure it's in there. I don't necessarily.
Right. Well, in the introduction, we would explain what it is we've been doing and what we intend to do, and see if that applies.
Okay.
Getting to Adam's point on expanding the RPC planning initiative, we had discussed actually instituting it under contract with the RPCs, similar to V-Trans and VHCD contracting. That
And that's
wasn't run
something we'd
through
certainly support.
VAPTA, and I would defer to the RPCs, but RPCs have that contractual relationship already with ANR and with basin planning and with V-Trans for transportation planning, so it would make sense to do something with you guys on energy
That is, I
planning.
believe, could be wrong, I think that is what we did for the first 3.
Right, but this would actually, the ANR plan stuff was passed through statute last year
Oh, okay.
in the bill,
Okay.
so.
And that's in part because we wanted it to be not something of the whim of a particular administration.
Right. Which I appreciate. But again, because that's specific to your PC, you would defer to that only.
No, I appreciate the thought and the suggestion, because you want it to be more than just a one-time thing if you want energy planning going forward.
Okay. Yep. Anything else on 1? Does anyone not agree, I'll say, can anyone not live, let's use that as a step going forward. Can anyone not live with the provisions of 1?
I would say something we added and we raised early on in the discussion is just strengthening the and it's in here in both sections, strengthening the policy statements in the planning act with regard to energy planning to reference the state planning goals more specifically in the comprehensive energy plan. And also, in accordance with Siting Commission recommendations, strengthening the energy element requirement of plans, both municipal and regional, consistent with those recommendations. And they're sort of in here, but
And does that affect any part of what's optional versus mandatory? In other words, the 3.2, C3.2, making energy planning mandatory rather than optional, is that part
No,
of that
again,
concept?
energy planning is
It is mandatory,
You have to have an energy element in your plan. So the siting commission recommended beefing that language up,
Right.
especially for planning and use in public
Yeah.
municipal proceedings.
So Sharon, can you just clarify, so you're looking, so the suggestion was to move some language that currently appears in the optional powers and duties of RPCs
Right.
to just duties of RPCs. Are you
Right.
saying that that's not the right recommendation?
No, that's true. That's regarding planning for distributed energy. And that would tie into getting funding for RPCs to actually work with the department to do that. The second are just looking at the planning goals under 4302 and the plan elements under local and regional plan requirements.
But it's already in there.
It's in there, again, the siting commission had specific recommendations for beefing up the element requirements and language.
By tying it to the comprehensive energy plan?
Well, by having a review process through DPS for plans that are considered in.
Oh, the other
Yeah.
siting
Right.
committee.
Yeah,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
that was for the purposes of trying to give more deference to the regional plans
plans.
once they were done. I mean, my experience with the regional plans has been that the type of work that we're doing now is not done even though it's a mandatory element. It's really from,
No.
hey, if we want an energy facility, where in town where we should go, right? It's very different than what
It
we're
is.
talking about now.
It's much more comprehensive.
So we did talk briefly about whether or not we wanted to incorporate those recommendations from the previous siting commission. You know, I don't have a strong feeling, although I sat on that siting commission. It may be that we want to have a general recommendation that the committees take another look at it, because we think that's a valuable, that is valuable and relevant. You know, and so the fact that it's not reflected in what we're coming out with doesn't, you know.
Because it does get to specific legislative language at that point.
Yes.
Right.
Unless there is a general consensus that we think that continues to make sense and want to put it forward again.
So I'd want to, I like the idea of tying it to the comprehensive energy plan. As far as a DPS review, I think we'd have some concerns about who our bosses are and whether I'm actually passing it before the region or I'm passing it before DPS.
Yeah.
And transportation doesn't require that, a lot of the other agencies. So I think under the statute, we're required to work together. And actually, you're required to look at our plans, but I want to satisfy, you know, my
Yes.
commission.
So the difference, the nuance is that you could just do it the way you do it always, and it wouldn't get the enhanced deference. And so it's all about making a decision about, do you want the enhanced deference to the regional plan? And if so, you need that second step of an external validator saying, this isn't just about the region, it fits in to the overall state plan. Because you could end up having a lot of regional plans that don't get us anywhere near where we need to be for the state plan. That was.
Which is why I like the idea of tying it into
To the CEP.
The CEP.
But I understand that, and having also sat on the other side of the generation, it's all coming back to me now. This was an area.
We were blocking it out
Right,
from
this,
PTS.
Something.
Or something, yeah.
this was definitely an issue in terms of what level of review or approval. But look, we haven't had that problem so far with the 3 regional planning commissions that we've been working with, and I wouldn't expect it. And generally, I look at it as a contractual thing. If I'm paying you money to do something, I would like the opportunity to review the product.
So that's true, maybe it doesn't have to be legislative.
We would not agree with having a DPS review the regional plan. We think there's value in having regional plans that are potentially different priorities from the department. And tying the regional plan to the CUP, I'm not sure. But the other thing that we had a big problem with in the siting commission proposals was sort of the privacy of the regional plans over municipal plans, and we have a big problem with that if that were sort of included in the overall agreement to go.
I would say
Siting
that
commission.
Looks to me like we're heading for a
we
vote.
don't have consensus.
We don't have consensus on this one, because if you're saying that, one, that you don't want it to necessarily be tied to the CEP and getting that as a conflict.
Well, and our recommendation is to reference that in the goals, the CEP and the state renewable energy goals, in our energy goals. And not in the plan elements per se. The plan element was to include mapping and to just strengthen the language under there with regard to, specifically with regard to siting. Right now, siting is not necessarily a consideration in local and regional energy plan as it currently stands. So it wouldn't necessarily get to all the review and approval and all that stuff. It's just beefing up the language that should be in the plan itself. And then I would suggest that, well, I don't know, Karen, but I think your comments about just revisiting the siting commission's recommendations.
Just have general.
Yeah.
I would suggest that the committees go back and look at that, the relevant things, make some things that might still be relevant today. Well, this recommendation was specifically to expand the RPC plan to include all regions.
It sounds like there's consensus on
It
that.
sounds like there's consensus on
Right.
that. What it's supposed to do, I guess, we could either be silent on it or we could have some disagreement about it. But I say I'm not paying for anybody to do something that is inconsistent with the comprehensive plan. Not going to do it.
I don't think that you'll get that in the first place, because if you're talking about mapping and suitable sites and that kind of work that Jim Sullivan showed us, the more you have that kind of information, the more similar opinions will be. But why do you need to approve it, quote, approve it, which, and this whole issue of state approval of municipal and regional plans turns Act 200 on its head, and has for several years, I'll say, but continues that trend.
I'm going to be silent on it in the sense that it's already been dealt with in the other previous iteration of the citing generation stuff. So I don't feel I need to emphasize it here. So this point was really get regional planning commissions to do a deeper dive around the planning.
And I think we can all agree to that.
Okay.
Yeah.
But Karen and I are on the same page on approval, although recognizing we're working contractually for you, you have I would say, a satisfactory degree of control.
I do too. I think so too. Like I said, I don't think it's been a problem.
And I'm comfortable with it so long as it's not tied to having an extra difference. Because I think it's a very different policy conversation, you know, when we're thinking about the public service board process and the degree of deference.
But the hope is if they go through this contracted process, that at that point, the plans will be enough that they can get that done.
Yeah,
Well,
and
we
that
can
would-
talk
I mean, otherwise, there's no point. Well, there are
Well,
other
there is a
reasons
lot
to
of
do it.
point.
There are.
There's a
There-
ton of
that's-
point
yeah,
to doing it.
But in terms of driving how we participate in Section 248,
So becoming a statutory party is good, so that makes sure that you're there with your information.
Right.
There'll be a natural deference if the plan is good.
well,
But in terms of having it be dispositive, if that, you know, which was essentially what's coming out of the other recommendation, without it syncing, having the requirement that it syncs with the state plan, I don't think that's good policy. So,
Yeah.
that's.
That's where we kind of were. So I suggest in this one, we just focus on the planning aspect of it.
Hi,
Hi, Ann.
I apologize that I'm late, and I don't want to belabor this discussion, but to the extent that I understand where you're at, Rev certainly thought that this recommendation was all about the plan, regional plans syncing up with the comprehensive energy plan. And to the extent that that's not going to be the group's recommendation at this point, I mean, our support for it was really premised on that, because we want this to remain a statewide energy planning process. And so I agree with what I just heard, that certainly there should be no greater weight given to the regional plans if they're not being tied to the fundamental document that lays out the state's energy vision.
I will, in that respect, and getting to Karen's, I will say that we also recommended some changes to Title 30 to better integrate land use planning into energy planning. And we haven't really talked about it around the table yet, so it's not something I'm expecting to see in the report or that we can discuss for consensus. But we're basically coming to a position that energy and land use planning have to be integrated at all levels of government. It's certainly too soon for the CEP. But it again, going back to what Karen said with Act 200, all state agency plans are also supposed to incorporate the land use goals, the state land use and planning and development goals. And they haven't been given consideration in the last couple of iterations of the energy plan. So, we agree that there should be some review for consistency with the CEP, but there should also be some input in the CEP on the planning goals when that's developed. But again, that's probably outside of our discussion for
This
now.
moment, yeah. So it sounds to me that we have consensus to continue to do the regional work. There's some, is it fair to say that it's the goal, the purpose of this work is to have regions address their role in implementing the comprehensive energy plan? Stopping there.
I think so, is the answer. I mean, what are we planning for, right? And I think it would be to help plan to implement the comprehensive energy plan. So I'm okay with that. And that link, and like I say, contractually, I think that's what's gonna happen anyway. Because in the contract, you're gonna say, show us how you're gonna get to there.
Yeah.
But we certainly would like more weight to go to the plan if we do the work, if we do this work. So, I mean, we can defer that, if we can't all agree on it, we can defer that conversation to the legislature, but I'd like it, it's something that we would support.
Right. I think we would also, I'm speaking for all of us, we'll see if we can. I
Well,
think we-
again, I'm not sure I'd put that in the plan element, I would
Right.
put that in the goals. Under the element, we had suggested specifically addressing the siting of distributed renewable energy as one of the tasks to be, one of the considerations.
Yeah. Okay. I don't see us pushing any further on this particular recommendation. You guys agree? So number 2, town planning support.
So I would suggest that we might want to say variable levels of energy planning and municipal plans or something like that.
Rather
versus
than lack of meaningful,
which
yeah.
is laden. We have a lot of towns who feel like they have done meaningful energy planning, it's just not being accepted. So,
Okay, so the recommendations specifically are creating tools for towns related to the RPC planning to create individual town layers. Statement of support for potential development, should funding be available of a model town energy plan and protocols and guidelines for towns are reviewing for energy planning. And potential legislative session, the suggestion is the same as above. So, to provide for essentially, including, comprehensive and land use pieces, sharing stuff. So let's open all that up for discussion, see what people's reaction is.
Under number 2, again, our recommendation was just to reference the siting and distributed energy. We, instead of high and low potential, prefer terms like preferred and exclusion areas to make it more clear that these are the preferred locations for development, these are areas that we want to exclude from development. And kind of borrowing from federal and other state terminology in those contexts. But,
Next, next.
Except that then becomes an issue of a definitional issue. What do those terms mean in this context? And are those economic, environmental, other social?
It's defined through the planning process, so it would have to be clear in the plan. And it gets to what, again, the pilot project showing in terms of mapping, where the preferred areas are, where there are specific areas, whether it's for aesthetic reasons or it's competing with the other industrial development and industrial park, things like that.
So
But-
are those terms really, are those the two terms that are typically used, preferred and exclusionary?
Or excluded is at the federal level.
Okay, as opposed to preferred and, and to avoid, preferred, and excluded is pretty clear.
Yeah.
Do not put it here.
Well,
The
that's-
corollary to that would be approve it here, and we don't have that. So you have preferred, it seems to me you need a similar.
Similar.
I-
Well, then the other thing, it could be more general and just state mapping and, siting of distributed energy.
That pilot project had multiple levels of suitable sites. There was like,
Right.
this is the top one, and there's a tier 2 that you could still have it, but there's restrictions like wetlands or ag soils
Or
or
it has
whatever
to be
the
mitigated.
qualifiers were.
So, yeah, we aren't saying we have to have those terms in there, but I wouldn't put necessarily
High
high
and
and low.
low.
You could actually even just take it off. Identifying areas of potential for the development of waters.
Yeah, that would be fine.
Like that. You feel okay with that change? That further discussion of the recommendation itself?
There's a couple of other things over here, and I don't know if they're addressed in the new draft from the last time, but there's also this idea of returning jurisdiction for smaller systems to communities under 117. And we would like to see a working or technical advisory group established to develop best practices for siting under the PSD. And that could include adapted, whatever the working group is appropriate for coming up with best practices. Because we never actually really got into that part of the discussion, what actually are. And I'm really concerned about things like statewide setbacks and statewide lot coverage requirements. I don't think they're especially useful in that context. So if a group came up and worked with you guys to come up with.
So that wouldn't be legislation, but that might be just a
Recommendation.
Yeah.
And it might need some money.
I would agree with that because I would agree with the comment about the statewide sort of setbacks and different. I just feel like it hasn't really been thought through. Like those are just numbers that were kind of thrown out there. Last minute it was like, let's say 50 feet and 100 feet. It's like, well, I don't think there's been enough kind of analysis around that part of it. And I think in the board's recommendations, they had something with lot coverages too, about percentages.
Yeah.
I think that could be a good idea, but I just don't know that. I think this should be looked into.
So I would, what I'm hearing, I'm trying to articulate it to see if people agree, is like a third recommendation suggesting that we develop best practices for siting in some fashion. It wasn't clear to me, Shannon, when we were talking about the purposes of delegating the smaller systems, which sounds
Well,
like
they're two
maybe
different
that's a
things. Yeah, the
different-
best practices would be partly to help guide local and regional
Yeah.
planning.
Yeah.
But it could also potentially be guidelines for developers in section 248. The guidelines, not standard
Yeah.
per se.
I mean, best practices, if we're talking about sort of a stakeholder process, I think that would make sense if it's a sort of just government-driven, and then the stakeholders sort of hear about it when the drafts come out. I don't think we would support that, but if it's really a government, private sector, planning sector, that would make sense. In terms of the discussion about whether the state setbacks do or don't make sense, I don't know that I want to open up that argument again. I don't know. I think actually the statute as written sets a minimum, but it allows it to be higher or lower. So I think it struck a right balance, and we wouldn't support saying anything about that, other than that we should give it a chance to work.
But I'm just unclear though, because it does set a minimum standard, which then the assumption is that there's an opportunity then to.
The Public Service Board has the ability to amend it, not necessarily the town couldn't say, well, thanks, but no thanks.
Yeah.
But so the best practices would help inform kind of that dialogue, so.
What should the setback be in this
Right.
context of a specific project?
So is it-
My reaction, I like the idea of developing best practices for this sort of thing. It's sort of how I was interpreting, and maybe that's something else. That's how I was interpreting this development of a standard energy modeling mapping protocol. It's like a model rule or a model best practice type
Okay,
standard.
so yeah, it could be folded in with that.
We could pull that out and put it into a third bullet if that makes sense for people. I kind of agree with Andy. I'll just weigh in and say that I would prefer not to, I think we got enough meat here to work on without necessarily trying to revisit something that was done either in last year's legislation or the board, because I feel like we would just be messing that up.
Our thoughts were to keep it until
Something
better
better comes along. I like that. Just like the kids, really.
Yeah.
Well, Chris, we kind of deadlocked over that issue last meeting.
Yeah, we did.
I think Sharon and I were saying that we'd like to make those changes because we don't believe they work or will work. And I think Andy was saying, no, we want to keep them and see if they have time to work. And we didn't come to consensus over it, so I don't want to
Okay, I see.
come to consensus by default.
Right.
There's a statement later on about not coming to consensus over that, calling it out as a discussion.
That's a discussion item. That would be the best we can do. Okay. So, anything else on number 2, which now includes the 3 recommendations? The 2 is written, the changes to, with taking out the high and low, and also to add third, encouraging that model or best practices task force type thing. I won't use the word task force.
No.
Working group. So the incentives, you want to talk about the smaller systems for a second before we go to the incentives? Because this is another piece of kind of town planning support or town effort. Does anybody, I feel like those go through pretty easily and are not particularly controversial. What I mean is like the 15 kilowatt and under rooftop stuff,
And so
personal
the
residential.
discussion we had a couple times ago about whether or not that should go through municipal.
Municipal planning, zoning, and/or review. I don't know that it makes that much difference other than making towns feel like they're more engaged with that.
Well, it helps deal, our view is it helps deal with local impacts in the weeds of solar siting in more densely populated areas and things like that. And it can actually promote it by ensuring solar setbacks in more urban environments. There could be a much better level of review. I mean, it initially came up just in terms of the impact on historic structures and things are considered accessory structures that would go through just an administrative review at that level, unless there was something really thorny that came up. that we
Right.
really could-
I mean, when you were speaking, it always struck me that these should just, like, as a matter of courtesy, they should meet all of the regular setback requirements that are established in the zone. There is no reason why they shouldn't, you know.
So, do
Would
we
it
amend the
be-
part of Title 24 that includes it as sort of required or permitted use? That can be, just like a daycare center.
You actually,
Or the
I
school,
think
the
you have
education thing.
language already that says you can't prohibit.
Well, it's already says you can't prohibit it, but then do we affirmatively put it in so that
So
it's
it's reviewable for
for site,
placement, traffic,
site,
noise, yeah.
side yards, setback,
Right.
yeah.
height.
I mean, the easiest, but maybe not the best, would be just sticking in the list where it used to be.
Mhm.
The other option would be to create something specific to smaller systems that gives the legislature more control over what communities can consider.
Then we have to, the piece that we were clear about is we don't want to create more bureaucracy or more steps for those projects, so.
Yeah, would it be
what
more
would-
just-
So would it be instead of anything with Public Service Board? Because I'm not sure that's
I
possible.
don't know if that's
Because
possible
of the hookups. So we have to do a little more
Right.
inquiry.
Yeah, we could phrase this as a suggestion to look at
Yeah.
the feasibility of doing it, but I agree that the issue is, I feel like the board, or at least somebody needs to decide the electrical connection in all cases and the safety of that. It's,
But usually
on the
the-
smaller systems, it's pretty much done as a registration right now,
Right.
anyway, so it's not
And
a
the
big
utilities the one that reviews that, right?
Yeah, that and my engineering department
Okay.
put that together.
We actually had a comment a few years ago from Burlington that they didn't feel like anybody was addressing those sort of code issues around the connection.
Oh, yeah. Oh, my lord.
The other
Good,
op-
because, we were just talking about the fact that this report is actually supposed to be legislative language.
That's a man.
So you're here to consult us, huh?
Thanks, Al. Nice to see you. Okay.
I mean, certainly we don't want to muck up the smaller systems, but the other option would be to have some kind of sign off by the town in advance of the registration,
Mhm.
as part of the registration process, to make sure that setbacks are met and they're not destroying an historic building or something like that.
We are in the planning and incentive section.
Yeah.
Not quite.
Well-
We're still in the town support,
Uh,
and we're transitioning into the incentive
Okay,
section.
but I just feel like we're now talking about changing the regulatory system,
Okay.
which doesn't seem to me.
What I was trying to, the reason I raised it in the context of town support was just towns feeling like, do they have a role, do they not have a role? We can discuss that later too. if you want. But I guess I'll put out here as a placement, and I think Andy's kind of right, it might belong in a different section, but I would be amenable to suggesting that in this report that we explore the feasibility of doing that. If it
We were just
simplifies,
to each other, yeah.
does that
that's
work?
fine.
Does anybody not want to do that?
Explore the feasibility of,
Of towns assuming responsibility for approving the smaller systems, if it, speeds things up, makes them feel more engaged, and that they get, they feel like they get better outcomes. I think it needs some conditions associated with it.
Yeah, and it keeps it out of full hazard areas and property lines and town rights of way and stuff. I mean, it's mainly to get to the little stuff.
Would the town be able to regulate that, like they would any other accessory structure, you know what I mean? Like, is
Right,
that-
we need statutory change to do that ultimately, and I don't think we're ready to recommend that piece of it, but the exploration of it, I have no problem.
explore taking over the process that is currently implemented by the board. In other words, if it's just the towns implementing the registration system, that's one thing. If it's the towns having a whole new regulatory, sort of putting it into their ordinary manner of regulation, I think that's a whole different. So I would
Right.
explore the towns taking over that which the board does now. That would,
And, yeah. Okay, let's,
So they really have to begin to explore from the beginning.
yeah, explore the exploration of.
It's worth a mention.
Right, it is worth a mention. I think it's worth a mention in some respects. All right, before we get into the incentive thing, because I think it's important that you have a little background, although I will have to tell you, I can only give you a little background because this is still a work in progress. But you know that the board is considering a new net metering rule. We've been talking about that. Comments are due on that tomorrow. We are frantically trying to figure out what kind of structure would work, but I just wanted to throw out, is he here sweating? Yes, he is. John is working on this every moment. And the only thing I can say about it right now is that we are trying very hard, and I think we will put this into our comments. Whether we get consensus from other stakeholders or not, I don't know. But we're looking to give an added incentive for citing properly cited things. And what I mean by that is the statutory things of rooftops, parking lots, landfills, brownfields, and then plus perhaps some other mechanism of giving an added bonus for citing that towns support or that neighboring landowners support. It gets complicated quickly. We're not going to have all the answers. And then also balancing the value of RECs depending on the siting and location of these, and who gets the RECs. If the RECs are going toward our program versus somewhere else, they can get different credit for that in terms of the actual rate that they would get. So we're trying to structure something like that. We're paying very close attention to what you're all doing here and trying to align the financial incentives with the goals that I'm hearing people talk about here. But all this is happening this week, and I just feel like hitchhiking to the Bahamas or something. This is crazy. But we're doing the best we can. I just want to make you aware that we're working on the financial aspects of this to drive this in what I think is the right direction. Toward rooftops, toward distributed energy, toward load, toward places where it's needed or wanted, and away from those that aren't.
We did endorse that concept in our comments to the board.
Oh, good.
Just to,
Yeah. I mean, I think, right, we think they got to work with the numbers a little more, but we think that was an important concept. So you guys already have your comments done for the board?
yeah.
Good.
Wow.
Somebody gave me the wrong date.
What do you get?
That's right.
Surely.
Right.
So are these aren't just for net metering projects? The incentives that you're talking about, they're for all.
They are, because everything else is done, everything larger than that, so this is up to 500 kW. There's everything larger than that that isn't net metering. There's a contractual way to get at those things. Those are normally entered into as a power purchase agreement with the utilities, and the utilities can say, yeah, thanks, but no thanks, or I'm not paying this for that site, I'll pay a little more. We've done that. Elizabeth Mine is a PPA example where we're paying more, the utility and the regulator, we're paying more for the constructability aspects of that. And then put pressure on people who come in a straight greenfield site, flat, and on, 19 cents a kilowatt. We're not supporting that. So.
I think it might just help. I think there are three models. There's the net metering model where the price is set by statute, or by the state rules.
By the board. That's
Or by the board. There's standard offer, which utilities are required to purchase the power, but there is a bidding process. So it does seek out the lowest cost. And then there's the power purchase agreements that utilities have with individual developers. And then that's a negotiation between the two.
Yeah. And then that middle one could argue that traditionally, that by seeking the lowest cost, you drive people toward the greenfield stuff, but we have the ability in that bidding process to say least cost, considering other aspects that you feel like are important, be they, siting preferences or things like that. So we have that ability. all by way of saying this, what I was just talking about is all just about the net metering area. Okay. So with that, I mean, so you know that that's kind of where we're trying to head as a department. So let's open up the discussion on the incentives. There's a lot of intro here that was added, and then a lot of recommendations. I'm just going to open this up for discussion.
We'll start?
Yeah.
So, I mean, as you pointed out, the Public Service Board is working on this very issue, you know, around net metering. And a lot of what's in here, recommendations apply to net metering. They were charged with looking at the cost and benefits of net metering and then coming up with a new program that balances. So, because the concern in the legislature was just this issue of cost shift. So they wanted to make sure they got it right so that there was value for all customers. So that's what they're charging. And then you have the S230, right, which kind of tries to get at some of the incentives as well, but also looking at, as we are, you know, citing how to use incentives to move solar and all solar in the right places. You know, I have a hard time here trying to, and I think someone mentioned the term mechanics, actually coming up with those set values, those dollar values, because of what the work that's happening at the Public Service Board. And they're looking at the whole program. You know, does it make sense for us, as we have, to articulate what it seems like there's consensus that we want these things located in the right places? Trying to come up with a dollar figure on what the value of that is, I think is pretty challenging for us without understanding all the dynamics of the economics of it all. So I'm less inclined to want to provide those specific dollar amounts and really keep it more general, knowing that the work is happening. And it will land. I mean, the board will come out with its rules, and they will, you know, set a price, and that price, hopefully and believably, will be fair overall. We'll take into consideration, again, cost shift issues, declining cost of solar, siting as a part of that, because as you maybe saw in the first rule, they are providing additional incentives for projects cited or preferred sites. So I think they're definitely going in the right direction. I don't know if we would add a lot, other than maybe confusion in trying to put out specific.
Well, my part, I couldn't agree with that. I mean, I have no basis for determining what would be an appropriate number.
So do we want
That's a
to?
good.
Well, the good news is I don't think we did, right?
Well, S230 is reference to
Right, as a vehicle.
co-location, even that in and of itself
Okay, that's
is
the
a
issue.
financial issue, because when you co-locate through the metered project, which is what's being proposed, then you're in fact removing the cap, right? So that is having a financial impact. The cap was there for a reason, and now you remove it, so that would have an implication. And then there's a 3-cent error or something, so.
So what would you suggest, how do you suggest we manage it? One of the challenges of this is there's a lot of moving parts outside of the setting process that are gonna run its course. Do you have a suggestion for an approach?
I think, again, there may be, in general, there may be a consensus on towns identifying particular plots of land where solar would be appropriate. And I think that, frankly, I think that's a great idea. It doesn't have to be all net metering. There's other ways, other models for solar development. So that's one way to show this mixed-use solar park. I mean, frankly, and this, I'm only speaking now for Green Mountain Power, you know, we see a real opportunity where solar deployment, particularly these solar parks, become economic solar zones or economic solar hubs, where that actually helps. It does a couple of things, but it can be used to help promote economic development within a particular town. So that really puts all the the control over to the town, where they're designating an area, and the designating area with the expectation or hope to bring on new economic development. And, you know, and the recommendation I put in my writing was, because I can't figure it out around here, but that would be a great opportunity, whether it's department, the agency of commerce, community development, to kind of explore that and come back with recommendations on how we can achieve goals.
This is the language you sent, it's on
Yeah.
page 6 for everybody.
I'm sure that any word a lot better. That's you.
So, okay. Can I answer that?
Yes.
Very briefly, I think that I embrace a lot of what Robert was saying, and the lot that I embrace is the notion that these are principles more than they are specific numbers. The concern I have in the things that you said is that it's sort of a faith statement about what the Public Service Board is doing. I've not been involved in that process, so there's probably more there than meets the eye, and what has met my eye are the draft net metering rules, which I don't think reflected that sort of mindful balancing of things. And I would like this board, this task force, in its statement, I tried to articulate however I did it, in the comment was that can we set forth some principle, at least speak on a principle basis, that it's more than just the numbers. There are also things like caps, and there are things like expediting the process. There are different ways. We want solar to be deployed. We want customers to not pay any more than they need to, but we want it done very well. So we want the incentives to point in that direction. I guess my simple point is can we say that we can perhaps develop a set of 5 principles or something that we'd like to see that whatever is decided address.
So I do think, I see how you could do that. I mean, for example, I found the 3 cent thing, which was related to the co-location of systems. If you simply said, you know, instead of saying the town designates this for co-location, they get 3 cents added, you could say, if a town, you know, wishes to set aside, you know, a solar park or co-location area, there should be a financial incentive to them doing that, and let somebody else deal with the actual dollar amounts. As a principle, would that work for people? Because that feels to me like the best, you know, that is comfortable.
And it's still very clear that it's a voluntary thing, that a town may
Right,
designate.
of course.
Just checking.
Oh, I was at Shell, I'm sorry, was that not clear?
I figured out how to run these things. I send different versions to each of you. One says may, one says shall, and everybody comes in and says, I think this is perfect.
My question in regards to co-location, I think you made a comment about the caps, right? So if, you know, Philip Ray says, I'm gonna do a 500 kW, and then they come back and they call themselves developer B, even though it's the same person, they do another 500 kW. So I don't know how you regulate that, or if
Yeah,
you
that's
could.
right. And there's some that are doing that.
Because they all, I mean,
Yeah.
you know, I'm Solar Task Force LLC developing a solar project, and then I'll change my name and call it a different LLC.
Yeah, and then obviously that's not the intent. There are some that will do that, but there are others, you know, who aren't doing that. But given the opportunity, they will co-locate, you know, 4 or 6 projects next to one another. That's obviously.
And there's a 20-acre minimum in there, I'm not sure where that came from, but I, again, would probably stay away from
Okay,
specific.
so this is, Anna was just clarifying for me. What she has quoted here were the S230 language recommendations, which includes the co-location with the 3 cent adder, 20-acre minimum,
3 cent
3 cent tractor.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the question on the table is, do we want to comment on the S230 that's pending Chris, it's a little bit like chasing your tail around, because Chris Bray said he put it in there really as a placeholder
Right.
for you all, so that, I don't know that it makes a
Well,
lot
you know
of
what,
sense.
I wouldn't comment on any particular bill because you've got upwards of 10 bills in that committee right now on energy siting, so why do you pick out?
Well, Chris is the one that said he introduced it as the
No,
placeholder.
I know he did, but.
But our principals would speak to third.
And it would
Right.
speak to all of
Yeah.
them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Start
So
from.
he's generally supporting the idea of co-location without the specifics in terms of the rate or the acreage.
He's gonna, I gather, he's gonna get plenty of testimony from stakeholders on every side as to what those numbers should be and why.
I prefer to actually not even use the term co-location. If we're talking about, designating a solar park, because then it could be anything really. And because unfortunately, the co-location, I think just, it it's not near co-location. So if we say co-location, I think that's where people will go. So if we say it's solar park, then it keeps it broad.
The only thing I would comment on the one point, it's number one under I-1, or 2I-1, page 6, where it's just talking about, providing the incentive for excess production. I know you mentioned that last time, and I think it just seems like that's not enough. And I don't know that if we're gonna make any recommendation, but I think the adder should be for the whole.
Well, I think the principle of net metering is that, you're only getting a payment back for anything you're producing above what is gonna net your bill out to zero.
Well, but so this
not
is an
Right.
incentive for locating, like on a new,
Right.
like.
It's a siting
A well-sited project, yeah.
incentive rather than.
I see.
So I don't think
Electricity
the incentive
incentive.
is enough
Yeah.
to make someone want to do that.
And it doesn't make sense. Yet, as it's defined, excess production is almost an accounting
Right.
rather than having anything to do with the performance of the system as well.
So, to let you know kind of where the department's planning on going with this one, we think the board got this one wrong. In the sense that, first of all, building on Deb's point, a net metering thing is really only supposed to be designed to no more than 100% of your system. But you're net metering and then you add everybody, so there should never be any excess capacity over time. And two, that it's just peculiar, particularly for the siting. It's like, okay, so I'm gonna site my excess capacity in a good location so I can get the siting incentive, and the regular capacity is gonna go in the greenfield. Or more likely, that's a little silly example, but more likely developers of net metering programs might take their recs and sell them out of state where they get 6 cents, but until they get to the excess capacity and sell those here. I don't know, but there are some strange things that would happen with the board's proposal, so we're hoping to get that straightened out.
And you're seeing some general consensus around that, so I think you'll see a lot of comments to the board asking for a change there.
Yes.
I'm sorry, I might have
Oh, no, I understand.
Yeah.
Yep.
And
Do you wanna know
there's
where
only
we are?
coffee in here, thank God.
Yes.
But, and I'm sorry if I missed this or if you've already talked to it, the first recommendation up at the top, was that yours, Robert?
Well, that's the recommendation there.
No, a recommendation to change to charge the Agency of Commerce and Community
Yes,
Development.
yes.
Having dealt with zones, designations, this is fraught with a lot of issues. And I have concerns about this recommendation. Because I think there are probably other ways, especially given what I've heard here, especially from Andy, that the Public Service Board needs to look at that broader public good. And designations as they're here generally come from the ground up. That's been the history in Vermont, that our designations come from, while there's statewide benefits, it really comes from the community to meet certain requirements. And I think there's probably other ways, whether it's municipalities that have really figured out where they want it, working with other parts of the municipal plan through economic development elements and stuff. I think there's other ways to do this than another
ring on a map. And so I have concerns about this.
I think we were talking about, maybe I can tie these together, I think we were talking about more encouraging solar parks or co-located areas. And not, you're reading this right, I know.
Okay, I just want to make sure.
Yeah, no, you're looking at this and wondering where you're seeing those words. No, this is part of the discussion we had,
Okay.
and it's a little further. It was actually on page 5 more so.
Yes, I was good
to
there.
encourage those things
Yes.
rather than this. Is that okay, or do you feel like somebody want to push the idea of a solar zone?
I think, I like the idea of having a solar, hubs or economics, and how we get there. I just kind of, former legislator, you kind of ask for studies when you don't know really what
I
to
know,
do.
and as someone that actually gets to do those
I
studies,
know.
and I don't necessarily go anywhere, especially if the department really feels like there's
Yeah.
issues with them, so talk to staff about this.
Yeah.
I think there's other ways to get at it than,
Well,
We
I
had thought
kind
of this.
of agree with you. I think solar zones are a cool idea, but I think it should come out of the regional and local planning process
That's
and not
exactly
through an
right.
agency.
I agree.
We also thought that it was a good idea to, just the concept similar to the downtown program, right? Just how to marry sort of incentive, giving towns more control, but giving the developers the incentives. And this was sort of the way, if that model is way too complicated or fraught, as Robert said, I'm happy to implement it in whatever way makes sense. But I like the idea of trying to marry those two things.
Well, I went one step further, I was thinking, because if you can designate these zones, and it is about economic development, this will require legislation policy of the state, but there's some reduction in electric rates for those new businesses,
yeah.
Either expanding or moving into that area.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that we hear, just, I don't want to speak for Karen, but from a lot of the incentives in the downtown, in the designation programs, the 5 that we have, is really for developers, it's not for the communities. And listening to all sides here, I think you could, as Sharon said, have something designated in a plan for a region, and they've got economic development, and encourage them to reach out to their businesses and have the benefit at a state level. And there could be more say, it could be the benefits for the business, there could be multiple layers. But I think there's an easier way to do it than another state designation program.
Okay with that?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Give it to someone else to study.
Yeah, my only desire was to see the public service department taken out of that sentence, and then I was fine. I guess I see the point. Okay. Okay. So we're gonna work with the concept, but still, try and
But
leave the.
yeah, and we need to figure out the incentives with how we would figure this. We would marry that with some of the other, it's not just doing planning, and I think that was the only other comment I early on wanted to make sure that it's not just doing what we saw kind of the first phase that the RPCs did, kind of figuring out where you could site solar, kind of doing that broad-based map, but really having communities in the region saying, looking at what our goals are, what the developer goals are, and other pieces of our plan, whether it be economic development, agriculture, natural resources, here are the areas where we want solar. And for that, what do they get, so to speak? And I think that's the get piece that we need to figure out.
So, I think we get, I get where we are in terms of this guidance, if you will, on S-230 or other legislation, generic legislation that might be coming out there for citing.
Can you sum it up for me, Chris? Because we
I
talked
hope
about a
so.
lot of different concepts, and I'm
I
a
think-
little at sea as to what actually became the.
So I think what we're saying is that the legislature should consider opportunities for citing locations in appropriate areas, and the incentives and opportunities are to, I'm going to use it as a verb, not as a thing, but co-locate solar parks or areas where developers would see incentives not only in terms of the development there for economies of scale or things like that, but because the businesses and things that might want a site there would also perhaps benefit in terms of net, especially if they're net metering, that's very clear, you can do it. We're still trying to figure out ways of getting, sorry, I'll finish the sentence and then I'll explain. Ways of encouraging, economic development as a means of encouraging economic development. Where I was going with that is it's still not clear that it's legal for us to direct electricity from one place to, like if you build a new manufacturing plant in a solar park and you're near the road, can I give you a break on your electricity price or a different rate? Probably not. Can I make you a net metered customer of that project? Yeah, we could do that.
We have economic development rates now.
Yeah.
So that's different. We can't do it because legally by Vermont law, or?
I think it's a FERC issue. We're investigating it. I'm not gonna, in my lifetime, I won't be able to answer this, but we're getting, once the comprehensive energy plan is out, I can get my smart people working on that to find out what the legal constraint is. My understanding is that you can't direct, if we have a solar project or a wind project or something, you can't let you direct your power that goes into the grid and is paid for by ratepayers or is in part of the grid. You can't have you say, I'm going to give it to this town, the electricity is going to be bought by this town or these people, or for that matter, I'm going to give the neighbors free electricity because they're putting up with the project in their backyard. I don't know. Weird, you could say, I can make you part of a group net metering program where you get credit for it, but I can't give you a different rate or free electricity.
If I just make it separate, so it's two different mechanisms. One is you have a solar park designated economic zone.
Right.
And if businesses that come into that zone get a discount on their electricity for a certain amount of time, because there are benefits to having solar in location, so there is some, but kind of keep them separate. It's not these electrons going over there, it's just a program of the state to.
So yes, I have just a question. Maybe I'm just not doing this the right way, but so if we're creating these solar zones, we've heard a comment that some people don't like to have solar projects in the industrial parks because there's already been sewer and water and all the infrastructure. So it's like some people, it's almost the flip side of the coin.
Yep.
We're concentrating solar closer together for economies of scale, but then we're going to put the manufacturing facility in the recommended solar park or zone. It just doesn't.
Just need to lay out concepts that people can maybe consider and let them do it. Because we can't tell people where it would. There are conflicts in this. I mean, the reason you're all here is because there are competing tensions on some of these things. We've got people who would be extremely happy to see all the solar not seen by having it be in industrial parks, right, or in the middle of the woods, right? And then we have people who think a little more about it and say, well, is it ever going to hold the trees? Right.
Well, also, we don't have a lot of sewer and water and areas for expansion, especially of any kind of size, and that would really be a concern, because there's really no money, federal money coming from infrastructure in terms of sewer and water.
Right.
Yeah. We want to make sure that we're being efficient. And, we've already made investments for a different kind of community asset. We should be doing that. Now, what I keep thinking about is, well, what about then rooftop solar or solar rooftop parking? When we go to California, they're just, parking all is covered with solar rates. So I don't know if there's a way to sync that in.
That's what I'm, because a lot of what we're hearing in industrial parks is, having going through another stakeholder process recently, is that folks don't want multi-story industrial. They want single story. So if you could use, yes. So if there's some incentive for rooftops on those flat
industrial manufacturing, that might be, and then it goes to ASA's, the first slide in terms of what's existing commercial and what could we use that for. We already have a building there, to put rooftop on top, it's not aesthetically, I don't think it's gonna be for the community a huge issue. And if we could, again, in some way incentivize that for both maybe the business and the community and the developer, what would that, I don't know what that thumb on the scale would be.
There's also a bill in right now to require, well, the study requiring that.
Construction, I think,
I'm not talking requiring, I'm just
Okay, so I don't know where you all think we are, but I think we're on page 7. And looking at the potential recommendations related to legislation, which is a lot more specific than I think I'm hearing people want to be. For example, should we be paying, X amount for people to cite gravel pits and those quarries? I think we just want to get across the point that we think it's good to incentivize that, but not and make it a meaningful incentive so that people do it, but not try and specify the amounts.
Yes.
Okay.
I actually would like to see us that comment that we don't think that's appropriate for legislation to set amounts. That perhaps set objectives for the regulatory process, but not. That's what Robert said as well.
Right. Anyone have an objection to that modification? Okay. All right, so now I'm on number 4 on page 7. And we were kind of just touching on this comment before.
10-mile radius.
Yeah, do you want to?
So to me, it's the same issue. It's very prescriptive. The point that's being made here, I think, the point that's being made here is that they want, as others have commented in the docket, that they see the value of solar being closer to load. And this is one way of trying to accomplish that. Over 10 miles out, it doesn't necessarily get close to load. But it was also another way of, I think, I'm guessing, I wasn't in the room when they were talking about this, but I assume it was also a way of trying to reduce the amount of greenfield development that's happening. So again, I think the direction, both we're articulating and what we're hearing in the docket, that's well known. That's what they're trying to accomplish. I don't know if setting arbitrary 10-mile distance is going to resolve it.
It's kind of a two-part thing. We agree that that's arbitrary. That maybe it would be helpful to define a community system as one type of shared net metering system, but a specific type of shared net metering system that benefits towns and neighborhoods, and could actually be in subdivision-ready solar net meter neighborhoods. I mean, there's provisions in planning to do that. So those kind of systems would get the benefit, the incentive, versus other shared systems that are basically just there to generate more power.
Because I think one of the issues that I've heard raised is that we're not getting a lot of what you just described, where it truly is a group net metering, where it's benefiting, or the off-takers are really the local community.
Right.
But it's really principally one off-taker, meaning county, getting their power from a project built in another county.
Right, there's so many, they nearly share, yeah.
But it's one off, or a very limited number of off-takers, whereas what you're describing is really, I think, more the spirit of what group net metering was.
Yeah, that's kind of my comment is that I've seen projects, energy projects where, say it's for a facility in Middlebury, and then the project is actually 2 or 3 towns away. So I feel like, and I don't know, like you miles is kind of an arbitrary thing, but I do have a strong feeling that net metering projects should be close to the off-taker. You know, if it's for a business, you know, I don't think they should be able to put their solar project, you know, 2 towns away, someone else's backyard, and all, you know, they're getting all the benefit, and then the other people are.
Would it be okay if the community that it's in is also getting a benefit as well as the business? I'm just asking, I'm just trying to.
Could, and is that kind of how this will be? I think that could be.
So a majority
It's-
of usage in the same community, greater than 50%, whether it's one off-taker or whether it's 30?
We've proposed in page 377 a definition of community scale solar, because I think we talked about this a couple of meetings ago. Community scale is a term that's tossed around a lot, but one of the elements of that definition would be that it serves the surrounding area. You know, that it's
Immediate neighborhood.
right.
Well, serves is a funny word, because you don't actually, the electrons don't flow, but what you're saying is the people who were contracting for solar would be contracting for solar is in some ways defined as proximate to where they live, is that?
Right.
Yeah.
Well, there are truly community projects where neighbors get together
Yeah.
and then there are the ones that are developed
I'm simply
basically
trying to distinguish
speculatively
the
and
idea
then
of the electrons.
sold the shares. And this would.
What's the rule? I think the reason why I balk at the 10-mile radius is, but I sympathize with the person who came up with it, because it isn't easy to draw another one. If you did it on terms of, I try to think of what are the logical structures, and the logical structures might be the network that you're on, the electrical network, because there you're actually adding value. You're delivering capacity to the network from which you're being served. And it might be defined then by the distribution networks, some networks. But I don't think we want, this is a long discussion that I think we're trying to stay out of. But when you start trying to say community, if you live on the other side of the municipal boundary and you're not eligible for it, even you're on the same electrical network, it gets arbitrary again.
So is
That's what
that
I'm trying to avoid, arbitrariness.
Going back to Sharon's idea that there should be a definition based on these principles.
It feels like a principle thing rather than a 10-mile thing.
But
There's
also,
one type of share, I mean, there are other shared systems that are more speculative, but I'm not exactly, it could be a percentage of households served or something like that, I don't know.
And again, this is still in the incentive section. We're trying to figure out, are we giving more money for something?
this is sort of let's, 10 miles to me is ridiculous.
Yeah.
If we want well-sited projects wherever they are, and sometimes, and if we want more of those projects to be closer to load or closer to customers, let's incentivize that. But let's not create disincentives or barriers for other projects that can't be located close to load or close to the customers for whatever reason. But just for example, it's a single customer, they have a large load, it's an institutional customer, but they want to be net metered. Because they believe in the statewide renewable energy goals for whatever reason. So let's go back to incentivizing well-sited, and if one of the values people want to promote is get at least some of those close to load, close to community, figure out a way to incentivize that.
Okay.
But I think there would be a disincentive for the folks who, let's say, didn't put it close to load, or didn't put it on rooftops, or whatever the preferred sites are, because that's where you'll get the additional adder. So if you want to put it there, get more, if you put it somewhere else, you won't get that additional incentive.
Well, yes, it's a disincentive, but it's not, the carrot is you get more money if you go there.
Right.
Rather than the 10 mile is a bright line rule, you can't do it. That was my point.
Okay,
So I think
So I
like
don't
you're
think
saying,
anybody's comfortable with the 10-mile thing.
Okay, that's unanimous. It's a good thing about having.
But I don't think we need to talk about that, right? Just,
Right.
again, our
What the principle
the
is.
principle, right,
The principles.
exactly. It's more, again, gets to the same one. We keep narrowing it down, but basically, we want where we think is best. And where it provides the greatest value.
Just to be clear, we're not gonna make any comment related to S two
A
thirty
specific
draft rule,
statute,
the draft
right.
board rule, which, that's the draft board rule that had the 10 mile. We
Right,
didn't
right.
come up with that
Yeah,
That's right.
ourselves.
No, we didn't.
So we're not gonna make comments, specific legislative suggestions, just general principles related to.
But
Yeah,
it
so
does
then we
sound
could-
like though, and maybe not everyone agrees though, that like a hard and fast distance is not a good idea. I mean,
Yeah,
that
we
might
use
be
that
one
as
of the
an example.
principles, that might be a principle that, yeah.
I see a principle as being that it'd be close to low because of the greater value that provides the grid, so that's a principle. I don't know if, do we need to say?
Well, if the group feels that there should not be a number somewhere, we should, and we all agree, maybe we should put it out there.
But also, this is, sorry, these are recommendations, not just about net metering, but for solar.
Right,
sites.
solar,
That's right,
right,
yeah.
as a whole.
So there may be some, I understand what you're saying, and that's,
Right.
but there may be some non-net metered solar projects that are
Yeah.
larger in scale that are not right next to load.
Right,
Right, exactly.
Even some that GMP
Yeah,
is doing.
well,
Yeah.
and there may be
That,
some,
the 10 miles doesn't, I don't know how that always works.
Right, that's,
Yeah, right.
Well,
Good point.
and again, we have incentives and some regulations already for net metered subdivisions, net metered developments. I don't know if they've ever actually been built under those regulations, but it'd be really cool to offer other incentives for that too. So that, you're getting basically solar net ready subdivision in terms of orientation, land for solar, in-ground solar, whatever, right up front as part of the development process.
So what if we just, as we add proximity to the list of qualifiers, if it's.
Is that good enough?
Yep.
I think that's.
And that's specific to that meter, because we would be talking about average solar.
right, that's right.
I would say specific.
Okay, were there any other incentives that people wanted to consider that we haven't talked about? Otherwise, I'm prepared to move us on to the process transparency and public participation section.
Real quick, this green language was meant to flush out where we didn't have specific legislative language before in the last draft, so this was an idea to have a portion of non-net metering projects be able to be carved off for net metering to communities or neighbors. So there's a piece of section 219, Title 30 that actually allows for that now. 219A gets repealed
Okay.
at the end of 2016, so this was essentially just recommending it be added back into section 10, which is the new net metering.
What page is that?
This language about that you can carve off a piece of a project that's larger than 500 kilowatts, so you have a utility scale system to allocate that for net metering. That a piece of that larger project can be net metered to.
So the concept here is you're building a 2.2 megawatt project, and you want to take, you're entering into a PPA for 1.7 of it, and the other 500 kW can be net metered to customers around that.
So that's sort of what's in right now, 219M, but which is only a pilot, I think, and it would make it more broader. Is that
Well,
what?
it would allow that to continue
Yes.
as we see that section is going away.
Right.
Yep.
I think that makes sense.
So I didn't speak with the other utilities on this one in particular, but my sense would be because the board was given the responsibility for weighing all the cost benefits of net metering and creating the new program going forward, this is something that they would know is in there. And if they want to carry this forward because they think the value is there, then they would do that. I don't feel comfortable recommending that we continue that. Statutory. So I'm looking at now, so I had two of us from the utility sector.
Any other thoughts on that? My reaction is it kind of goes opposite of the direction we were just headed.
That's
in
right,
terms
that's
of-
exactly,
In terms of ensuring that the community stuff is next to load and, available, though it is the consolidation concept.
The only thing, the benefit that I that's intriguing to me is that, it's almost like a form of mediation, right? So we're sorry that you're getting a 5 megawatt project in your town, but here's 500 kilowatts of, you know what I mean? Or, I feel like you get something they can offer up to the community or the neighbors. I don't know how that, I don't really know if that works or not, but it's
5 megawatt in your town, you're getting a pretty sizable tax.
true, the town is, but not the.
It's been one of the tensions, I think you're right. Matt.
Maybe not like the dozen acres that it.
I think that was the idea behind it, but, you know, that's not. I don't know if
How's
that's
the pilot projects work?
right.
Have people taken it?
I haven't heard that. I haven't heard
Yeah,
that.
but Chris, maybe this goes to a point I think you made before, and that I've heard from, for example, from some wind developers. If there was a way under existing law that you could have a project that had some piece of it going to the local community by way of electricity, or then it starts to balance out cost and benefits, or benefits.
Well, they start to feel like they have a stake in the project.
And I think the same thing is true here, where you're taking a large-scale, non-net meter project, putting it clearly, I mean, there's very few communities where it would be near load,
Yeah.
so it really is likely not to be near load. But then how do you offer that community, participation in a net meter?
Or the neighbors, or, yeah, that's right.
Is there a way, so if you have a 5 megawatt project and you want to give something to the town, is there a way of doing that where you're not then creating, 500 kilowatt, more expensive power? Is there a way of providing some of that power for the community where it's not net metered?
That's
the
your
part-
pro-
That's
that's
the
the-
project that we, that I.
That's the sort of Vermont is not deregulated problem, right? So you're not allowed, you can't offer preferential rates.
Rates, and, right, so that's what we need to look into.
So maybe there could be a different way in which, you have a carve out for how that particular aspect of it meters on the project is. So maybe it's not, it doesn't have the incentive, doesn't have the siting incentive.
Right.
It doesn't treat direct.
Because truthfully, all of those incentives are designed to try and deal with the fact that these are smaller systems with less economies of scale. And if you're putting it in if you're carving it out of a 5 megawatt project, the cost is zero, no difference, right? So, interesting point though, I like Rich's point about that being maybe the easiest way to get immediate community benefit around. And I'm not talking about,
You get that all the time when, you go to these public meetings and people are like, what am I getting out of this meeting right in front of my house?
and telling them that they're getting a break on their taxes doesn't help that
Yeah,
much.
which.
That those solar panels are paying you free from the taxes?
No,
Telling them because.
That the nice try. That the municipality is getting tax benefits, property tax benefits from the project.
Right.
So is there a way of capturing this so it reflects both what you're suggesting and the value of the community, but that it would reflect the economy of scales, so that net metering now is 19-20 cents a kilowatt hour. A 5 megawatt facility is probably 11 cents. So there's
To build it, yeah.
so big difference. And with 11 cents, you got the RECs. With 19 cents, you don't.
Right.
So if there's
Yep.
Wait, I don't know how that even works now, like, are there two separate systems, or are they just kind of like figuring out what the production is and saying 500 kW of that is net metered?
It's
Like, I
not
don't know.
being done right now that I know of. I mean, I don't know. Yeah, I mean, I think it was set up to, but I don't think anyone's done it yet to answer those questions. Right.
Personally, I like the concept of being able to do
I do too in concept, but I don't think it should cost.
Right.
It's good enough if you're willing to give them electricity. They shouldn't have to pay for it.
If anything, the developers maybe should just carve out 500 for their gifts to the community and don't charge anybody else for it.
No comment.
Okay,
So
there's a-
So we're gonna articulate the concept here that it is helpful if one can find a way, the vehicle, and this might be one vehicle to do it, but that the pricing should be appropriate for the economies of scale. And they're not gonna put any numbers in it. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay. All right, I'm on to process transparency and public participation and I've got
6 minutes.
6 minutes for me, and then you can torture Sam for the rest of the time. Sam's willing, and John will be here as well, I think.
Can I just ask you, just process-wise,
Yes.
because I may have missed this?
Right.
We're going to 2:30 today, is that right?
Yes.
And then, because we're not going to get through this, what's the game plan?
So, okay, actually, let's take a couple minutes to talk about that game plan. For those of you who are very attentive to your emails, you may have seen them hint that if we wanted one more meeting, we potentially have the opportunity on Thursday to continue. And there's a window of, what was it, done before? And to see what people's appetite was for getting together one more time.
Can't be in this room.
Tier 3 work group is here? Well,
No, we thought we,
we bumped them.
we thought they were gonna, they can use their boardroom. As long as they get there.
I have a conflict that whole afternoon,
Yeah, I do too.
as does rep staff, so I think,
Do you feel like, I mean, so I'm thinking that
Can we go later today?
you could go later today, and yes, it depends, I mean, can we go later today?
I need to get back to Burlington, I'm not sure I can do later today. I guess to my mind, the question is, and I hate to say this, but are we hell-bent on meeting the 15th, or are we hell-bent on making sure this group has met and talked through everything first? Because I just don't see, unless you go forward on Thursday, it seems like we are running out of time.
So have you considered with Chris Gray an extension of time for this?
Yes, however, the last 2 of the 3 reports that were due, the last month and a half, I've asked for extensions on 2 of them, so I was hoping not to, but I will. Yeah, I mean,
Yeah, the good thing we found out, this was my first trip for asking for an extension, there's really no penalty.
no, there is not, as Tim Ash told me in response to one of those requests, he says, well, I don't think there is a jail for late reporters. So-
I mean, I don't say that lightly. We
I know.
understand they're waiting for us. We know this is important. But I'm feeling a little rushed right now. There's so much material in here now from comments from everybody.
Yeah.
It's fairly difficult to just sort through that, and so.
So then I guess my suggestion would be this. I think if several people, or a majority, or a quorum of people could get together on Thursday, that we should take advantage of that, even if other members can't. And then we work through one more iteration of this, and then do another draft out to people, and we'll have to arrange. I'm not sure what happens after that, but as part of that, it would need to be an extension requested of Senator Bray. The problem is that he's got me coming in talking about S30 on the 19th, which is next Tuesday, and I think you guys were asked, somebody else was asked to
There's a
come in on the
bunch of people coming in on the 20th.
20th.
Is there stuff, is there pieces that we agree on that could help guide your testimony? I don't know.
Oh, yeah, I'm
Just
hearing
not
them.
through-
Yeah,
just
yeah.
not through the first
I'm
part.
hearing them.
I mean,
Right,
yeah.
and by the way, I'm going as the department representative. I'll talk about what I think the task force is, but I'm not trying to represent.
I mean, there's a good chance, I am concerned about Thursday, and I apologize that I know I can't rearrange my schedule.
Right.
Because you are going to end up dealing with some of the meatier, more controversial issues that we've spent all of last meeting talking about. And for if I miss that, and then I end up having to dump on you a lot of comments because I'm not happy with where you ended up, that's not going to be productive.
We've also already covered this.
Okay.
Yeah, I've got a testimony. Someone else I've been called.
Like, common question I have is, we had asked the board, they're already waiting, they're extending, they know they're extending. So I guess,
Right.
what are the issues of moving it back even further is, that
So-
it'll change how they, their draft rule.
Well, let me say it this way. I think if we move it back, we're not talking about moving it back very much because I can't.
We're thinking about a week.
I'm thinking
Yeah.
a week or
Yes.
less because I don't think we've got more opportunity than that.
So
Yes.
What about a Wednesday morning, the 20th meeting? Is that a block of time? We could either start
That
at
would-
8:30 or 9. And if there's
That
not a
would-
room here, we can always find room in my shop. And I won't be here.
Motivation Trust.
For the whole morning.
I'm on a bus trip for 2 days.
I'm talking at an Nuclear Regulatory Commission conference in Philadelphia.
So
The 21st of the month?
Did you say the 21st?
Yes.
Yeah, that works for
in the
me.
morning.
Yeah.
I have something that I'm hopping in the hood, but yeah.
Okay.
I mean, I-
Why don't we
yeah,
block,
all
why
day.
don't we plan on blocking off the 21st in the morning, so starting at 4 AM?
I can't be. You'll send out an invite?
Yes, we will do that. Did you say you can't?
Can't be there before 9.
Before 9? No, we're not planning.
I wonder if,
January
in preparation of that, why don't we have a copy of sort of where we are with consent already?
Yep.
And then the places, looking at the comments, what you think the consensus would be. And so that people who can't be here could also say, if this is where you land, I'm good. So that even if you can't
Right.
actually be here.
Well, will the next draft, that's the, hide all the comments up to now?
I think we would do that, yes.
So really clean it up.
Clean it up.
Kind of what
Choose the
we agreed
actual-
to date,
Yeah.
and then
And
comments.
have the
that we go with.
prefatory contextual language, and then, would that jumpstart it, you think?
I think that'll help speed it up.
And we're going from 9 to 5, what are we doing?
Nine to.
The governor's
the
budget
governor's
is that
budget address, I think. we
Yeah,
should-
that's
right, yeah.
He'll hold it off.
9 to noon.
Good late.
But smartly cited this one. Yeah.
Okay, and I apologize, I'm gonna have to step out. Sam, I'm turning this over to you if that's okay. And, as you wish, and, if I can find that squirrely John, I'll send him back in the room because.
He's with Billy.
He's with Billy, okay.
I was thinking at this point, since we only have 10 minutes, to invite public comment,
Okay.
since we were going to address,
After we do the press conference.
unless there's anything in those last few bullets that any of you want to throw away to the hopper or and to consider issues on agriculture, transparency, Good. So is there any of you who from the public wish to make any statements? If so, observation. I don't see any. Good. Shall we? I move to adjourn.
I think we should, we've got 10 minutes.
Okay.
I think we should keep going. We're
Okay.
here, this is,
I'm game. No,
Yeah.
that's good.
and we can capture it, and we can, maybe this section, so the next time we can, just because folks are out and Billy's not here, we can capture it. I think we should keep going.
This is one of the sections I have.
Since you can make it, especially, yes.
Yeah,
since you-
It was, this is an important section, not that they're all not important, but this one, I was confused. Yeah, just, now we're under process transparency and public participation. And I had a general comment, which is, I felt like we had covered a number of issues that were not reflected in here, and either it's that my memory was poor, or but I just,
What's Jen want?
So,
well, I
made some comments. You had suggested 12, 14, 15, and 17 were not covered. 12, these recommendations were written up for where there was consensus.
Right.
I didn't hear it on 12, 14, and 15 are reflected a little bit further down. So
Yeah.
14 is in 6C little I,
Okay.
and 15 is in 6C double little I, and 17 I did add in 6C triple little I.
Okay,
So if those don't work, let me know.
okay. And 14 you said was one that you just,
14 should be in 6CI, 6CI.
okay.
So,
All right, well, I don't want to jump over mediation, so let's take
so
that.
6C
Well, let's just
little
work our
I
way
was
through
the
it,
public
since I wanted to hear
assistance.
you had general comments.
Yeah. Well, that was, I didn't have a general comment about mediation, except that I wanted to make sure, our conversation, we thought we talked about maybe two different concepts for mediation. Sam, I feel like your original idea was almost like a pre-application mediation process, so that you resolve the conflict before you got into the permit process.
That's right.
And what we talked about a lot at one of our sessions was mediation after the application was filed, but before the Public Service Board renders a decision to push the case into a contested case format, so that there would be an opportunity for mediation that may involve board staff where they're not conflicted or they have ex parte problems, right? So there were really two completely different concepts about mediation.
And towards that, what is your comment?
Well, I don't know that this reflects those two different tracks of mediation, the sort of pre-application idea, which was, I think, your original idea, versus this, once the application is filed and it becomes clear that there's conflict, but before the Public Service Board heads down a litigation road, that there'd be a way to resolve the case.
Yes, one will speak for my own, and that was the notion that there've been different versions of this stated, but the idea was just some encouragement to developers and communities to get together, and if something came in that showed that they were all on the same page, that you would offer some, you might reward that. You would not only enable it, you would, by rewarding a faster process in some way, you would encourage that to happen. I think Chris had suggested that in other ways, but that was the idea.
And that gets back to the planning process, and that goes away, the community discussion I heard happen at that level too. And if they define where they want preferred locations, then that should help. The process, when it gets to the project level, is often more about neighbor concerns or specific impacts, or how to mitigate those. And you could also, it's also about siting in general, but hopefully the siting decision has been taken care of in advance.
So Jeannie Oliver had added some additional commentary in here in green. I think generally we were leaning towards recommending the board develop a mediation process, feeling that it was beyond our powers to tackle or design what that is right now. I don't know that that captures the first part of what you're suggesting, but the draft rule does have some, more, the draft net meter rule tries to capture, or tries to urge the towns and neighbors to have at least more advanced notice, and the developer will work with the towns for 150s and 500s. So there's a little movement in that direction already.
I'd be inclined to drop the first track entirely, because I think that, picking up on your thought, that in fact this is really addressed in the context of community planning.
It should be.
It should be. Well, I mean, that's what we want. I mean,
Yeah,
that's
it's
what
more
we.
of a conversation, pre-application than mediation. Right. Because mediation's a.
That's right.
Right. Yeah, there was more of an, I got that. There's more of an informality to what you were describing. The word mediation may not fit that situation. But then when you do get into the permit process and mediation, Right, you can imagine that could happen at different stages, it could have different levels of formality. I agree with you, the Public Service Board would probably have, and their general counsel would probably have strong opinions about how to design that or what they can do and still meet their responsibilities for ex parte. But I'd like us to be a little directed because I think the board can be maybe a little bit overly conservative on this front. For us to send a message that we think either the legislature or the board should make available a process where developers and neighbors are trying to mediate disputes before you litigate the case. Before you're pre-filing testimony, technical hearings, doing discovery, doing all those things that cause a great deal of time and expense. And frankly, the neighbors often come in and say that the process is so burdensome and so expensive that they can't do it. So there should be an early off-ramp.
Okay. So in terms of.
So I think this does.
So in framing this, should we offer two separate comments? Two separate concerns with two separate solution pathways? That's what I hear coming out of this conversation. So taking back so we would preserve the notion that there would be a pre-application. That our recommendation would be to encourage pre-application consultations between stakeholders and the developer, with the idea that the outcome would be a presentation in the application of findings of consent or agreement.
That's a good way to put it.
Okay, so that would be concern and solution A.
Right.
Concern and solution B, I can speak to the concern is that I think you were talking, if I understood you correctly, that once an application is filed, there should be an informal deliberation process.
And maybe, this,
mediation.
the way this is written up is actually is pretty good. If you add your first concern and the second one, right, it's really about participation in the 248 process. And so I think the way these recommendations are written is generally broad enough. And did you say that Jeannie Oliver read this?
She put in this green text you see here. So this, you guys,
Right.
it's a slightly different version of what you got last night.
Okay.
She added it in last night. So
Okay.
the green parts are her suggested language and also complications she brought up.
Okay.
So, you should comment on that.
I'm going to have to look,
I'll send this
there's no way I
to
can
everyone.
read that, but.
Yeah, the red on green is hard to read.
Lighter green.
Yeah, it is.
It is.
Right.
One caution, just based on our experience with mediation in the environmental court, they send everything to mediation, and there are situations when mediation doesn't make it where you need to be. So if the Public Service Board were a little bit more discriminating than the environmental court, that'd be a good thing.
Yeah, it's often a tough, it's a hard judgment because sometimes the notion of mediation is that you kind of force people in a room together and see if they can reach agreement, even if they don't want to be there.
Right.
If you always leave it to people to decide on their own, often just because of bad feelings, you may never get to mediation at all. So I don't know, I'm not sure how to strike that balance. But I know what you're saying about that oftentimes mediation leads to zip because and it ends up being a little bit of a waste of time. How do you
Could you capture that thought?
Yeah.
Because I
Could
think
it be
that's a
at the
good
request
thought.
of a party and or at the option of the board?
I mean, part of it might be the difference between the outside mediator and a board staff person. What happens in federal court sometimes is a court staff member, a staff attorney, you're required to meet with that staff attorney and they kind of read people the riot act. And it's more like, all right, they try to sort through the issues and really give parties a sense for what they really should be talking about. That is much different than going to a neutral mediator who's just there to kind of listen and help navigate. So, again, it really depends how the board designs the process. You can imagine different kinds of.
And I don't have any experience with those processes to comment.
Certainly put a time on it.
So in terms of what I heard you say that you thought that it was written up pretty
I
well
think-
as is. And do others feel that way?
It's, because it's fairly broad. Enable PSB or outside mediators hired by the PSB to play this role up until the point the case becomes contested. I have to look at Jeannie's new comments, but.
Okay, well, we'll reserve that for the next
Could
draft.
I just ask a clarifying question? Are you envisioning this just for the non-statutory parties and the petitioner, or would the mediation pull in the statutory parties? Because I don't know that.
You don't want to be pulled in, or you do?
I don't know that we want to. I feel like we maybe have the resources to kind of negotiate in good faith with the petitioner outside of this process.
I would agree that that's usually the way it happens, and there's,
But is that the best way, especially if it's something that affects another party too?
we do have, I hear what you're saying, there's kind of a tried and true practice now of A&R attorneys dealing with.
I'm just thinking from a resource perspective, creating an opportunity for neighbors, community people to have access to this sort of mediating service. Like, we almost always have disagreements with an applicant at the early stages of the process. I don't want to consume all of the mediation services to work through issues that we normally work through in the course of business. So
Yeah.
it's just something for y'all.
Yeah, I think it's a fair point.
But it could be if they're mediating on something and they come to an agreement that impacts any of the other parties, at some point you need to think about that.
Right.
So if they want to move something that's ag land, or there's already an agreement on archaeological sites, that's where it becomes sticky, because that's the other thing I want to bring up. I thought that we were statutory parties, and we're not.
No, just.
And we are absolutely in there, and I think we've done well, but it's time consuming because we're working through A&R. So might be requesting that we, along with ag, be just added to the list, so at least we get the notices at the same time. Because that's one of the issues that we're having right now, is that we have an agreement with a developer, we're all good, it goes into, and it gets renegotiated, and then it's back on archaeologically sensitive lands or something like that, and we're not involved in that, and it's an issue.
I think another question with respect to mediation is, what's the Public Service Board's obligation? It's sort of a different aspect of the same kind of question, to take the agreement that's arrived at.
Well, I think that's similar to a court, which is the judge or the board has to exercise some judgment.
And the other factor too.
Especially if it's an application, at the end of the day, the board, like they do with any stipulation, they all have to make their judgment whether they can accept what's been agreed to. Because it's not like an appeal of a court case where a party agrees to essentially withdraw their appeal, and then the court essentially has no say in whether they withdraw their own appeal. But here, it's not an appeal. You have an application, the board has to render its judgment based upon the 248 criteria. Parties come together, they reach an understanding, that gets submitted to the board. 9 times out of 10, or 9.9 times out of 10, the board is going to accept that settlement without change, but every once in a while, people ask for things, the board says, we don't have jurisdiction to do that, or that's totally inconsistent with the way we've resolved this issue in other cases, we won't do it, so.
It's just like any other development project, just because Public Works signs off on something doesn't mean that, your DID or your zoning board's gonna say, oh,
But having the mediation managed by a hearing officer or someone from the board helps kind of with that continuity piece.
Yes, yep. And again, that's one where I'm sure the board will have strong opinions, but if the recommendation we make is without dictating the outcome, basically say we think that there could be a mediation process that could involve board staff, that prior to it becoming a contested case, or hiring outside mediators, and then let the details, we're never going to figure out the details here.
So I'm going to ask, can I ask her a question? And this is one of those questions I wish I didn't ask, but I'm going to put out there. So what are we trying to accomplish with the mediation? And who, I'm just not sure who all the players are, and then
So, and who's gonna be in the room? Who are the two folks that get mediated?
Again, picking up on the original idea, I think it was to address those cases where either neighbors or maybe even towns have a problem with the project. And there's a lot of, and as I've often seen, there's often miscommunication bordering on complete lack of understanding between the parties about what they're trying to accomplish and what the compromise might be. And so it would be a way, and lobbing comments into the board is not often the most effective way to resolve disputes. So it would be a way, a neutral forum for neighbors or other parties to get their concerns heard and hopefully resolved, other than relying on the developer or the neighbors to come together themselves.
I think it's
And
supposed to be
also-
like less contentious and less legal and easier to have access to
How
for
many,
neighbors and
you know,
communities.
Yeah, it's
That's-
basically alternative.
The number of cases this may apply to, it's not clear to me at this point. But if your concern is, gee, does this end up pulling in everybody else, and it's gonna kind of draw, then waste resources by the utility or the A&R, I think that's a valid concern. And I would start by saying the mediation should really be only the parties who are in dispute.
Right.
And it may not fit in other words, if GMP has a dispute with the developer over the system impact study, probably not the kind of thing that should be mediated. That's gotta be.
I wasn't even thinking utilities were in front of that actually, because you have developer, local community.
Yeah.
Or whether the screening's adequate, whether.
So that's
it's-
And I think this is gonna be less of an issue as if the planning, like what we talked about prior with the planning coming on, I
That's
think.
gonna take a while.
I think it'll be
honestly,
less,
It's gonna take a while.
but I think it'll be less, like the towns won't be necessarily surprised if a solar project is happening in the preferred solar zone. What's there so many
I'm going to try
differences?
to, in this next item, I think is in the same sort of context of an informal process, numbers at the bottom of page 9. And that's the idea of having a board assistance officer. This, to me, seemed like an easy one for us to agree to, because remembering the conversation, I didn't see that much disagreement on that idea.
I need to leave in a minute or two, but.
Yeah. That's why I'm sort of trying to squeeze in.
Yes, the only thing about that is the broader discussion we had is that it may be more than simply a public assistance officer that the board needs to effectively run a program that has this many permits. And it may be what they really need is to identify a program manager, run this like a permit program, have a program manager who is not behind a veil, who people can deal with, and maybe they have staff, maybe they're the only staff. So,
And I think this is actually a larger question, because I heard yesterday that one of our staff called to ask how many copies they needed to bring to the board, and they could not get an answer from someone. So I think there's a broader issue here that we need to somehow capture and maybe.
yes. So Sam, it is an easy one in the sense that we all agree something needs to be done.
Yes.
But the way we describe it is not a 1 second conversation.